My thing went off before as I'm trying to use modern technology to make sure that I don't blab on. So I'll turn it on. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. And I want to thank Sandy and David for they've been doing this Summer Institute for a long time and encouraging research. For those of you who are very much wedded to the history of economics discipline, there's a battle that's going on in the discipline itself over the nature and the style of the research. And what I like to think of in terms of Sandy and David's work is that it combines the best of both of the kind of traditions that are actually normally trying to fight with each other at the moment, in the sense that they do deep contextualization, but they also have analytical analysis of what the arguments are that are going on. And so anyway, I want to thank you for that, because I think too often we dichotomize the discipline and to the detriment of both of those things. So rational reconstruction goes over here, and history goes over here, and we don't actually see the connection between these things. And I apologize to the young people who were at my table at lunch, because I got too worked up about all these things. And you should not have that as a role model. I should be much more, sophisticated rather than lacking in sophistication and screaming and calling people names. Anyway, that should only go in the memos. All right. So this, it's interesting. You're going to look at this and you're going to say, but the paper that's in my packet is titled differently. But the paper that's in your packet is titled differently than what I told David and Sandy I would talk on. So I'm like trying to pull one on it. No, I'm actually not. They're kind of related in the sense that I have, as Dick Wagner has also had this, since Jim's passing, we get a lot of opportunities to reflect on different aspects about Buchanan's legacy and whatnot. And so I've written probably, and going to be writing or committed to writing, a lot of papers on this. And so the paper that you have in your packet is, and I'll get to this in a second, it's about Buchanan raising challenges to the classical liberal agenda, which he thinks unless we repair, classical liberalism will fail to inspire and therefore fail to capture the imagination of young people to think of it as a progressive research program in political economy, let alone its impact in the broader society. And so Buchanan always was willing to make those challenges. But I want to sort of suggest that that kind of way of thinking that you would see evidenced in that paper is also what you would see in his career and the way that he tried to do various different research programs. See, one of the things that's really fascinating about Buchanan, and people who work in the archives can find this, is that Jim Buchanan turned down opportunities to teach individually at a lot of elite institutions. Okay? We know, for example, that he turned down going back to the University of Chicago within less than 10 years after he was out. Okay, because in his essay, No Regrets, he talks about that particular one. When I was down at Duke a year ago, they were talking about, now that the papers are all coming in about the various different places. Buchanan had an opportunity. He was offered, Crawford Goodwin tells the story, he was actually offered a chaired professorship at Duke. But his condition was that they had to give one to Gordon Tullock as well. And the faculty voted against Gordon Tullock, so Buchanan didn't go. Steve Medema can tell you that Buchanan actually was offered a chair at Stanford, but he refused to go. He went to UCLA for 1 year and then came back. Now, why was he always doing that? It's because, like Vernon Smith, Buchanan wanted to be part of a collaborative learning environment that he wanted to create, because it had to have some bigger purpose. My favorite story about Vernon Smith is that when he went from Purdue to Arizona, he had opportunities to go to better schools. Arizona was not a great school at the time. It became a great school. People said to him, Vernon, you can't go to Arizona. It's not a top department. And he said, by definition, any school that is a top department. But Vernon, and it's very fascinating when you look at the archives, because when Buchanan is moving, they're moving in mass. So, for example, what I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, and I hope that I don't get the story wrong, Dick Wagner was actually part of this, is the move from Blacksburg to George Mason. But the problems in Blacksburg start about 5 years before the move happens. And they're dealing with overtures from schools to bring the center. And the center goes through a various different evolution, actually, at Blacksburg, in which they originally are part of the program, the Department of Economics, and then they want to isolate themselves from the program. And it's for the same kind of discussions that we talked about earlier, but the focus is going to be on the methodology and the relationship with that. And I want to sort of walk through that before I get to the actual discussion here. So I want you to look at this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's from Simon's syllabus. Simon's syllabus was something all the students at Chicago had to work through. People like Gordon Tullock, brought out Simon's syllabus as published through the Center for the Study of Public Choice. When I was a student, we all had to get it. It was given to us as one of the things. And I think Tullock stayed for many years the president or whatever of the Henry Simons Association, which had 3 people in it. But 2 of them were here. Yeah. Academic economics is primarily useful both to the student and to the political leader as a prophylactic against popular fallacies. If you become someone who believes that this is the purpose of economics, it's going to affect you in a certain way. And I want to use Buchanan as a case study in thinking through this. So it's about a conversion. Buchanan tells us that he was basically a libertarian socialist when he showed up at the University of Chicago. And within 6 weeks, he's converted to understanding the nature of markets by Frank Knight teaching the price theory course. And one of the things that Buchanan always puzzled over was, why is it that he had such a strong reaction, whereas fellow classmates might not have always had the same reaction? So what is it about that mind quake that Buchanan experienced that changes the way he does things the rest of his life? And what I want to suggest is that he gets converted to this issue of an understanding of market theory and the price system. Right in the beginning of his graduate education, it's very important to study the citation patterns here. Because here's another thing that's going on. He gets influenced not only by Knight, but the Austrian economists before there was such a thing as Austrian economics in America, and before these people become iconic figures on the right. Okay? So they're obviously the road to serfdom is out there and whatnot when Buchanan, that's 44. And so Buchanan is being educated after that. So I'm not saying that Hayek isn't known or that Mises isn't known as a person on the more market-oriented side, but they're not completely discredited in a way that they become later on in American intellectual culture. Human Action, for example, when it first comes out, it's published by Yale University Press. All right, and it's a book that people talk about. And if you read Buchanan's early essays, in 1949, 1950, 1951, he cites human action throughout those essays. And the reason is because he sees it as part of a push for what would be called methodological individualism applied across the social sciences. And it's the same thing with Hayek's Individualism in Economic Order. The timing of those books are 1948 and 1949. And so not only do you have Knight, but you also have the Austrians, Mises and Hayek, very much part of just what it meant to do good economics, not any hyphenated economics. That's a phrase I got from you. No hyphenated economics, just economics. And these guys happen to be part of it. The second point that is important from the beginning that Buchanan recognizes is that there's a political, legal, and ethical foundation which forms the framework within which the market economy operates. And so what you have is economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And one of the things I'll come back to as we talk here is Buchanan's effort to form what he calls an appropriate institutional economics. And what's going to be shocking to you, I think, is the dates at which I tell you he starts arguing for that position. Because it's before Doug North, it's before Ronald Coase. Anyway, right from the beginning, he's talking about forming an institutional economics. Now, Dan Hammond will know this, David Mitch will probably know this, certainly David will know it, but not everyone here knows this. Ross Ebbett argues that's what Frank Knight wanted to do at Chicago, was created institutional economics at Chicago that was different from the institutional economics of Clarence Ayres. And what I'm sort of proposing here is that Buchanan and Nutter see that as that's what's part and parcel of this last point, which is they come to an agreement when they are graduate students that if they ever have the opportunity to work together, they would work to save the books and to save the ideas, which is my understanding was originally one of the motivators behind what you and David got started on, right, Sandy? So it's this Nutter Buchanan idea. Well, it turns out that within a decade after they graduate, Buchanan has to go back down to Tennessee first, right? And then he goes from Tennessee to Florida State, and then from Florida State to UVA. Part of the reason why he has to go to Tennessee is I think that that's part of his agreement of his fellowship that went to Chicago, right? That he had to return back to the state of Tennessee to teach. But he rises very quickly professionally. I mean, it's not like it takes him all that long to go through the normal things. And so they find themselves at University of Virginia. It's actually Nutter's there and brings Buchanan there. Is that correct, David? Is that an accurate statement or no?
Oh, I don't know the date then.
Okay. So this is the founding of the Thomas Jefferson Center. This is a document, I think David Mitch actually made reference to it earlier about what the purpose of the Thomas Jefferson Center is in 1958. Is this what you were talking about, the document? This is the paragraph that describes why it is that they're having the Thomas Jefferson Center. And I want you to sort of think about what's all embedded in here. Thomas Jefferson strives to carry on the honorable tradition of political economy, the study of what makes for a good society. Political economists stress the technical economic principles that one must understand. So let's stop for a second, right? It's technical economics is first and foremost. So that's where the science comes in. So slightly different from the way David was doing the divide, which is the way Robbins does it. I'm going to suggest that what Buchanan is trying to argue is blend social philosophy and technical economics, and it's the tacking back and forth between the technical economics and the social philosophy that is going to generate political economy in his mind, and that political economy is a value-relevant discipline only to the extent that economics is a value-neutral science. Okay? So actually there's probably not as much of a divide there as in your position, because you don't want to do art like willy-nilly, right? But it's like a way to try to make that art be disciplined. Maybe that's the way to put it, a disciplined art rather than an unconstrained art. So the political economist stresses the technical economic principles that one must understand in order to assess alternative arrangements, that's institutions, all right, for promoting peaceful cooperation and productive specialization among free men. Yet the political economists go further and frankly try to bring out into the open philosophical issues that necessarily underlie, so what used to be treated as unspoken presumptions, we're now going to force you to talk about explicitly appropriate functions of government. And this is an old point that Buchanan stressed, which was that all public finance relies on an implicit political theory. You can't do public finance without having a political theory. So the choice is either a conscious and articulated political theory or an unconscious and inarticulate political theory, but don't believe that you can do public finance without political theory, which is why it is that it was so important for him and the contributions he gets from the Italians, because they're going to change the perspective or the window in which you think about the nature of politics. Okay. So, David and Sandy are doing outstanding work on this. Yeah, go ahead.
The previous quote, is it published material? Or
yes, it's in a newsletter that the Thomas Jefferson Center published in 1958. If you email me, I will send you a PDF. But if you just type in Thomas Jefferson Center, it will pop up. It'll be one of the first things in Google. Either it will be or some talk by me talking about it. Yeah.
This is actually for the last slide, just quick. Did Hayek and Buchanan overlap at Chicago? And I know that Hayek was not in the econ department, but did Buchanan have any interaction with Hayek at that time in the late 40s?
No, but his involvement with the Mont Pelerin Society is much earlier than people had led me to believe. And not only that, a leadership role in the Mont Pelerin Society. And I'll quote from a memo he wrote to the general membership. So Buchanan's not that old, and he's already pretty much, he's a viable voice in the MPS, which means he would have interacted with Hayek a lot. He has a kind of an interesting relationship with Hayek, and and Mises, because they're European intellectuals. He doesn't really like Europeans love Buchanan, and Americans like the northern, what he referred to as the Eastern Establishment economists. I won't tell you what that code word was, but the Eastern Establishment economists didn't really like Buchanan. That's what Samuelson's getting at. But in Europe, he was always treated very nicely. But he didn't really like European deference. So the way that Mises and Hayek are very aristocratic in some sense. And Buchanan's really a populist. We can talk about that, but that's his gut reaction is populism. And so as a result, like for example, his obituary of Hayek is, "I never called him Fritz," right? Which is kind of interesting, right? Because, so for example, Buchanan liked Jack Weissman. Jack Weissman was anything but aristocratic, right? So that's the kind of people he liked to hang out with. And so Hayek and Mises, and he particularly found it difficult with Mises because Mises and his followers, as the years went on, certainly treated Mises with a level of deference, which Buchanan didn't think was appropriate for true intellectual affairs. And you can see this in his critique of MPS stuff. But all right, so David and Sandy told you about the controversy at UVA. It's quite clear that Buchanan and crowd never would have wanted to leave Charlottesville if they could have stayed there. They came increasingly to feel not comfortable in that environment for a variety of reasons. Tulloch not getting promoted is a key issue. Obviously, Coase not getting matched. One of the funniest stories I've ever heard about Tulloch not getting promoted, I have no idea if it's true because it's from Bill Bright, but it's a funny story, is that Bill Bright says that they were at they were late one day going to have their tea. And he and Tulloch went there, and there was only 2 seats open. And they had a visiting sociologist from Columbia, he wouldn't name who it was, and the dean. And there was 2 seats, but no other seats available. So Tulloch and Bright sit down, and the sociologist was talking about how we needed to have unilateral disarmament, because if we had unilateral disarmament, then there would be world peace and all those things like that. And so Tulloch turns to him and he says, "Well, what would the Soviets do if we engage in unilateral disarmament?" And the guy from Columbia says, "Well, the Soviets would disarm, obviously." And he says, "By the Soviets, you mean you and your friends in New York." And that, the dean and this guy scoffed at Tulloch and then said, "Well, what do you think would happen if we engage in unilateral disarmament?" And Tulloch says, "We'd be run over by the Mexicans tomorrow." And these 2 get up and they walk out of the room. And Bright says, Tulloch, without missing a beat, turns to him afterwards and says, "I don't understand why they won't promote me." In David and Sandy's document, I think it's interesting to note that they keep on going through all this stuff about how we have no political affiliations. And then it's pointed out to them that Gordon Tulloch signed a thing saying economist for Goldwater, and they're like, "Hey, Gordon Tulloch says that." And only Gordon would sign that one, no one else. So it's kind of interesting. But, all right. So I don't want to talk about the UVA stuff because these guys have already done that. And you can read their paper and get that and follow up on all that stuff. And plus, it's a more discussed idea than the Blacksburg move. But the Blacksburg move is just as weird of a move, right? They had established normal science in Blacksburg. Public choice had kind of become on its own, a regular sort of subfield. They had visitors, books being published regularly and whatnot. And so social philosophy and political economy becomes normal science of economics and politics. So the kind of broad arguments, and by the way, it's kind of an interesting thing. For example, Ronald Coase never would have called himself a public choice economist, but he was a proud member of the Thomas Jefferson Center. That, think through that. Like, where's Coase coming from? And he has a slightly different perspective. So the public choice sort of evolution of the idea, as you know, these are the 3 hallmarks of public choice: methodological individualism, rational choice, and which I'll come back to in a second, and politics as exchange. The issue with rational choice is that it's a hard-nosed behavioral model and an insistence on a behavioral symmetry in the different environments. So you get the proposition, same players, different rules, different games. Okay? But it's not an as-if descriptor nor a normative benchmark for decision making. All right, what the rational choice model serves in the hands of people like Jim Buchanan is, and I don't know if Maria's going to talk about this in her thing, but it's the Humean dictum that in designing institutions we must presume that all men are knaves. And then how about if we took care of the knaves? Or a line in Adam Smith and TMS, which he says, all the evils of government are not brought about by the conscious efforts of government, but the failure of government to guard against bad men. So it's not, so it's the failure of government to guard rather than the idea of promoting a bad idea that leads to that. And that's a kind of an interesting thing, thinking about money and whatnot. But it's an analytical device in constitutional construction. What's fascinating in the archives is that Buchanan and Tulloch were working on a companion volume to the Calculus of Consent called the Calculus of Control. It never gets published as their book, but I'm pretty sure that it gets published as the Reason of Rules. I think it becomes, the ideas of that become the Reason of Rules. One of the things that I'm learning in spending time in Buchanan's archives is that there's very few unpublished ideas. They are ideas that have an early manifestation, get tabled, but then get picked up as projects later on, and then developed and worked out further. But he and Tulloch had a whole book manuscript, and they were applying for grants, sending out money. So who knows, maybe, I don't know enough to say whether or not they didn't do it because they didn't get the funding, but then later on him and Brennan got the funding, I don't know. But they were going to do the calculus of control, and starting with this is the control of individuals in their behavior, then to firms in their behavior. Eventually it's about universities, which becomes academia and anarchy. This is a project, and they start working on this as soon as they move to Blacksburg. So just think about it, that's 1969, 1970, and yet when he writes or publishes finally the Reason of Rules, it's 1985. Right? So that's a project which was worked on, tabled, and then come back. But it's him sort of thinking, Buchanan thinking through using this rational choice model, again, not as a normative benchmark in, say, the way that behavioralists use it, not as an as-if descriptor in, like, say, the way that a Chicago person would use it, but instead as an analytical device for institutional design. Right? What if these agents were that opportunistic? What rules could I design such that it would discipline their opportunism? It doesn't require a change in their nature. It requires a change in the payoffs that they get for being that. And that's the way he sort of thinks about all that stuff. So, let me make sure that I...
Can I ask a quick
go ahead.
practical note? The term public choice, when did that come into play? Do you know?
I think that they started out as the economics of non-market decision-making, and I think the journal is published as economics of papers in non-market decision-making. How many? Maybe there's two.
Volume 4.
Volume 4, it changes to public choice.
Which is when? What date is roughly?
67.
67. So there's still a Virginia in there.
Yeah. So I do think that that's a fascinating history that needs to be written as well, which is the history of the Committee on Non-Market Decision-Making, because you have in that people like Rawls and, it's a very, very, Julius Margolis, Will Riker, they all go, it's a really pretty big movement. It's not just Buchanan and Tulloch, right? It's a big movement that the Ostroms are all part of that as well. Okay, so what happens is, this sort of breaks down. And this normal science breaks down. And Buchanan identifies it with a single individual, which is the institution of Dan Orr becoming the department chairman at Blacksburg. And so when Dan Orr becomes the department chairman at Blacksburg, Buchanan believes that what's going to happen is Dan Orr is trying to turn Blacksburg into a third-rate traditional department. And what happens is they start having fights, and at first Buchanan can't believe it because he's like, look, we are accomplished, they are not very smart, why does anyone pay attention to, I'm being serious, this is in the memos. Right, so you might not always win friends and influence people, but it's like, so why are you allowing them to turn our great department into, now just put this back in context. When they moved there in 1969, the Public Choice Center was located in the president's house. So they were given this beautiful environment to like work in. And VPI was not a very strong school, and it just got a new influx of money to become a very good school and build up. So previously to that, it was really a school for sports and the cadets, okay? And now they were going to make major investments in the sciences, and they chose to build with the Public Choice Center as their critical thing in the social sciences. And so Buchanan was used to being treated with a certain amount of respect for what they had accomplished and achieved. And what happens is that Dan Orr is not convinced that this department is all that great because our ranking isn't as strong as the conventional rankings. So it would be like the research assessment exercise today. And people coming in and saying, how many SSCI citations do you have, right? And as a result, for our community, for example, Hope got delisted, right, from SSCI, and it created a big stir because that means anyone working in history of economic thought can't publish in what was considered the flagship journal in the field, which means what happens to the field, right? It doesn't exist. Hope, by the way, is back on the list, but these research assessment exercises have these kind of things that you have to recognize, and they're going on in Europe right now. We, of course, live with it in the United States all the time because the pecking order of citations and all that kind of stuff is just part, David can tell you this because he's done, he and Barclay have done a lot on the profession. The elite in this profession know what their citation count is. Just like if I went up to Derek Jeter and I said, what's your lifetime batting average? And Derek Jeter would know it. And I said, who's the next best shortstop in the Hall of Fame that knows your batting? He would know it, right? It's not like he sits and says, I'm above that, right? These guys aren't. I mean, I've been in rooms with Schleifer when he actually tells you what his citation count is, or, they know what's going on. These guys know it. And so what happens is Dan Orr wants to go on that conventional standard. And this starts a thing, and it starts also with prelim exam results, right? Who controls the prelims, what the results are on the exams. And so, as Buchanan sums up here, the basis for the conflicts that emerged in Blacksburg were strictly in-house, so to speak. That is within the ranks of the economic faculty itself, rather than between our faculty and outside enemies. In this respect, so Virginia, right, is outside enemies, not insiders. This is all inside. In this respect, the problems we faced were categorically different than those faced in Charlottesville almost 2 decades earlier. Further, there were few, if any, ideological elements that entered into the Blacksburg arguments, quite by a contrast to Charlottesville scene where those elements were paramount. So in Buchanan's mind, what happens is that there's a methodological divide in the department. He has to separate out from the department and then create it. Now, what is it that he wants to create? He wants to create the environment to go back to that Thomas Jefferson program. In the memos, and Dick, I'd like to hear your comments on it. In the memos that Buchanan's writing to you guys at the time, it's clear that he thinks that the normal science of public choice is winding down, and it's going to lose energy. So at the same time he's fighting against Dan Orr, he's also trying to rally the people in the center to produce new and exciting work that's going to generate the same kind of excitement that he attributed to things like the Anarchy Project, which led to the limits of liberty, the deficits, and the democracy and deficit thing, these kind of things. He wants that kind of done rather than, and he sees the rent-seeking project at this time as maybe one of the ways that he could do that. That's the Towards a Theory of Rent-Seeking Society, yeah.
When did Dan work?
78.
Yeah.
So this festered for a while.
Yeah, and when did the center separate its operations from the department? About a year later?
81.
81. So this stuff is going on. I mean, I have the dates actually in here. So he decides that he's going to go to even this weirder school than UVA to Blacksburg. He's going to go to George Mason, and the reason why he's going to go to George Mason is because he can dare to be different at George Mason, right? Rather than being caught up in the day-to-day sort of methodological battles. He can go there and create something new, and that was exciting to them. And so, as he says here, the new entrepreneurs at George Mason in Fairfax, Karen Vaughan, Wade Gilley, George Johnson. George Johnson was the president at George Mason at the time. Initiated the move of the center. And I like this, the way he puts this. The program did not move to Fairfax over and beyond moving from Blacksburg. The program did move to Fairfax. Right, the opportunity to construct a new graduate program with its potential for good graduate students. Of course, I would pick this passage out. Was indeed of major importance. I think that's a kind of a critical part of the story is that this is in the memorandum from Buchanan to the center faculty dated 14 April 1983. In sharp contrast with the current arrangement at BPI, the faculty of the center can expect to have a major input in departmental decisions on recruiting, on promotion and tenure, on curriculum, and on graduate student administration. So what I can gather from the memos, and again, I haven't checked this with Dick, but the way it appears, the way Buchanan is telling the story, is that when the center separated from the department, the focus primarily became on the internal research of the members of the center and visitors that they had, rather than the idea of any kind of involvement with the graduate program as being paramount. So they did their teaching, but it wasn't something that was essential to the way they thought about the center. And the way he's sort of suggesting is here is they're going to help design a brand new PhD program. They're going to influence the curriculum, right? They're going to, select graduate students. They're going to have a big impact on who gets hired, who gets retained, and all of that kind of stuff.
Didn't they move in '83?
They move in 83, Mark Crane goes there, and then 84, they move all, like Buchanan and Tulloch move in.
That's 82. Mark was in
82,
82.
83 academic year?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Buchanan comes 83, 84?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So what's interesting is that I always tell everyone that I'm very fortunate because I had Jim Buchanan as a teacher between the period of 1984 and 1986. I had him as a teacher even after he won the Nobel in '86. So, but what's cool about that, the reason why I bring it up, is that Buchanan was supposed to win in '84. All the rumors, I don't know if everyone remembers it, but all the rumors were he was going to win because he had been to Sweden the summer before or whatever. Gordon made some stupid comment, but nevertheless, then this is on tape, so I shouldn't say this actually. But I mean, Gordon said something about there's no good Swedish economists or something. But everyone thought that he was going to win, and then he didn't win. But who they picked instead was, in fact, probably from Buchanan's point of view, the worst possible type of pick. It was the Stone-Geary production function. So it was really kind of economists as dentists to the nth degree. So as a student of Buchanan, the reason why I liked that was because he was really, really pissed off. And so he was in his most angry sort of form about the establishment of economics. And he would try to excite us about, thinking about economics, dare to be different. There was no doubt in his mind, your purpose is to dare to be different, challenge to receive wisdom, overturn, these people. He has this great essay, which is written a little earlier. He says, perhaps I should retire with alcoholic breath and hoe my cabbages. He says, but that would only be if the economic technicians were improving knowledge, but they're not. That's the kind of spirit at which I had him. Then after he won, he kind of had like a Sally Field moment. They liked me, they really liked me, and then he sort of, backed off of that stuff. So I had him during this time, and he was very, very radical and pushed those kind of things. And it just so happens that also during that period of time, that decade that he's been at George Mason, you have a bunch of external things happening. Like, for example, the fracturing and declining and then eventual collapse of communism. And all the questions that throws up for people to study. And that changes, I think, Buchanan's perspective from an economy in which you have liberalism versus socialism to grappling with the reality of a post-socialist political economy. Right? That becomes a kind of a big part of the question. How do I study a post-socialist economy? So constitutional craftsmanship versus evolutionary efficiency.
And just to put this in perspective, this is actually the core argument that's involved in Buchanan's contributions to the Summer Institute, right? Because what's his concern with the new Chicago school, right? They thought that the market could generate its own rules, rather than having the rules anterior to the market, and then, so ratio nation should establish the framework. Then what we do is we allow the processes within the framework versus the idea of the evolution over the framework itself. And so Buchanan's grappling with that kind of issue, not only with post-socialist reality. I do want to point something back to my paper, which is, let me point first to page 18, footnote 1. This is from the Calculus of Consent. I think this is actually a very striking passage from the Calculus of Consent, and also potentially one of the weaknesses in the argument of the Calculus of Consent. It says here, this is Buchanan and Tulloch, it says, our analysis of the constitution-making process has little relevance for a society that is characterized by sharp cleavage of the population into distinguishable social classes or separate racial, religious, or ethnic groupings sufficient to encourage the formation of predictable political coalitions in which one of these coalitions has clearly advantageous position at the constitutional stage. I understand the point that Buchanan is trying to get at with a big key part of his system, and David and Sandy have been fantastic in pointing this out, is this analytical egalitarianism. So to understand Buchanan's position, he has analytical egalitarianism, and then he has this normative desire, a society that exhibits neither dominion nor discrimination, non-discriminatory politics, and non-dominion in human relations, okay? So I understand and point about that, but in our reality of this post-communist position, or in the failed and weak states in Africa, or in Latin America, or wherever, this is the reality we have to deal with. We have to deal with a world divided by, right, heterogeneous agents, made up of ethno-linguistic divides. And how is it that you can find ways for them to live better together, right? Think about South Africa after apartheid, right? How are you going to sort of deal with that? Does that say that the Calculus of Consent can't say anything to you about that? Well, maybe if you conceive of the Constitution process as only top-down, it can. But how about if you see it as from the bottom up, which is going to lead to my next point, which is an Ostromian move that needs to be made. I think this is all part of the future of Virginia political economy, I think. So, this leads us to the next point. So, Vincent Ostrom gets overlooked a lot, even though he was a foundational figure to public choice, and he was a very foundational figure both to Jim and to Gordon in respective different ways, okay? And what Ostrom does at the same time that Buchanan is raising this question about the rules themselves are what has to be analyzed or up for grabs, Ostrom comes along and says if public choice, the Blacksburg version, simply is an appendage to neoclassical price theory, it's a dead research program. So what we need to do is you need to sort of reinvigorate public choice by taking what he calls an epistemic turn. By that he means not only knowledge systems, but also study of beliefs, ideology, whatnot. For those of you who study public choice a lot, you all know that one of the real difficulties of public choice is coping with ideology, right? It's very easy to talk about models of interest, but very difficult to talk about ideologies and their impact. What Ostrom is talking about is you have to talk about those belief systems in order to be able to sort of make this next move. And once you do that and recognize that, you are stuck in this kind of weird world of entangled political economy. Unfortunately, I wasn't here for David's talk. I was here for Dick's talk, and I have read a lot of Dick's stuff in recent years. And part of what Dick's doing, and part of what I take David to be doing, is saying that the strict dichotomization, state-market, is a false dichotomization, right? And that instead the world is made up a lot differently. Now, I think, we would have disagreements about where, maybe there's some dominant mechanism that can do, and we can sort that out. But this entangled political economy point changes the way in which we have to think about the relationship between political economy, the relationship between agents and the political structures, because we can't treat them as just simply state is coercive, markets are voluntary, and then that's it. There's some kind of mixed or hybrid forms. And also, I think what happens here is Buchanan's work forces us to think about questions not only having to do with the scale of government. Dick can tell this story because Buchanan asked this question back in Charlottesville. I'll tell you, he also asked it in Fairfax. Buchanan wasn't like Wittgenstein, didn't pace and say silly things or whatever. He actually read little notebooks, that are yellow, like the old legal pads, and he would like put his glasses and he would read pretty much his thing. But he said the following thing in our class, in my public finance, whatever it was called at the time. He says, "It is said that a fly that grew 9 times its size could no longer fly." What does that say about fiscal dimensionality in the welfare state? Okay? Write an essay on it. All of us are like, what the hell is he talking about? All right? But he asked that same question, Yeah.
Yeah, he asked that very question my first semester as a student in the political finance class. And everybody in Charlottesville was Mr. And I raised my hand and said, "Mr. Buchanan, could you give us some idea what you're looking for?" And he shot back and said, "Mr. Wagner, if I knew what I was looking for, I wouldn't care what you thought."
And by the way, I don't know, you might remember this. So you asked him a question about it, and at the time he was reading this book on the dancing woolly masters. It's a Zen and the dancing woolly masters. He read a lot of English literature, because that's his first degree, and his mom, I guess, was a great reader, and so he read a lot of that stuff. But so he would read this and he'd say, "Oh yeah, it's like in the dancing woolly masters." Okay, I'm not going to go to the library and read this book on Zen and the dancing woolly masters. But I think what he means here, right, is that's an issue of scale. But there's also a question of scope. Go back to his original Thomas Jefferson thing, and he wants us to ask the questions as a research team about, what are the philosophical presumptions in our public finance? Well, what are the philosophical presumptions in our public finance is what is the appropriate role of the functions of government? Well, if what you have is the idea of the scope of government gets so large, right, that's going to have an impact on issues of scale by definition. So David, I don't have the citation for this, but I've been told this by various different people, but I can't find the actual citation, so I'm hoping you might be able to tell me or someone else, which is supposedly Keynes has a great argument on this. He said, you cannot make a fat man skinny by tightening his belt. You have to make the man skinny and then his belt will be looser. Do you have any idea where that might be from? If anyone can find it, I'm willing to pay. I haven't been able to find it at all. What? Dr. Phil? No, it's Keynes. Keynes. It's not that. Yeah. So I don't. Yeah, Phil Keynes, his cousin. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's. So we're gonna put this in. Let me point out one other passage from the paper, which I think sums up these positions well. It's page 16. And it's the first paragraph. It's from the Supply and Demand of Public Goods, which I don't know, but this might actually be the thing that Samuelson's talking about, but I don't know, because it's around that time. Its original is published in '68, which would have been around the time to get a grant, write a monograph, and do it. And he refers to it as a monograph, but I don't know. I'd be interested in finding it. But Buchanan here points out, appropriately thorough analysis should include an examination of the institutional structure itself in a predictive explanatory sense. The economist should not be content with postulating models and then working within such models. His task includes the derivation of the institutional order itself from the set of elementary behavioral hypotheses with which he commences. In this manner, genuine institutional economics becomes a significant and important part of fundamental economic theory. All right, and I think that's what Buchanan's trying to institutionally create and cultivate with the various efforts in the society there. Again, this Knightian project of a genuine institutional economics. So this leads us to this issue of the future. This is some self-advertising. and this is, Sandy probably doesn't want me to do this, but I'm advertising it, you know. Now, but I think it's interesting because it relates both to the Blacksburg story and to the Charlottesville story in a weird sense. Science, or scholarship, whatever you want to call it, relies on various different contingent moments. So at George Mason University, we actually have a thing called the James N. Buchanan Center for Political Economy. And when I moved from New York down to Virginia, I moved precisely because I was given a leadership position in that center. I was named the deputy director of the James N. Buchanan Center. I believe somewhere at George Mason University you will still find that I am the deputy director. When Bob Subrick was a student there, I bet you were a James N. Buchanan Center fellow, right? But we never could do the kind of things that we wanted to do with the Buchanan Center for a variety of internal institutional inertia issues. Couldn't get the kind of independence that we wanted, couldn't get the kind of independent funding we wanted. And so what happened was, just about 2 years ago, myself, Dick Wagner, several other of our colleagues, a total of about 9 colleagues, decided to create this other center called the F.A. Hayek Center for Advanced Studies in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. It would have made sense just to call it the Buchanan Center, but we had our hands tied and we couldn't do a lot of the different things, okay? And so we created this sort of new center. Now, how did that happen, right? That happens because of things that, like you're talking about in those memos, right? Which, you know, don't need to happen, right? I'm always amazed because to me, I think there's like ridiculous small notions for Pareto improvements that need to take place in universities all the time, and universities don't take it. It's like, what gives? I mean, this is like you have to move this much and you get this much in return, and they're like, eh, you know, like that. And I think it has to be that they don't pay the consequences of their stupid decisions. I think this is true, by the way, in a lot of hiring decisions. I would love it if like people on hiring committees had to wear like a placard around the rest of their life. You know? I passed on this guy or girl, and you know, and look what happened to me. You don't have, so I'm all in favor of shaming. You know, probably one of the reasons why I don't win these battles, right? Anyway, what?
Whatever happened to Dan Orr?
Whatever happened to Dan Orr?
He left retirement in Illinois. I think he's retired now.
Right. He became a truther. Oh! Doing 9/11 truther.
Oh, it's him and Paul Craig Roberts.
Yeah.
So, all right. So we created this center. This is what we're trying to do to capture that Thomas Jefferson program. Pete.
Is it a center or a program?
That's a university rule.
I know.
If I call myself an institute, I have to have tenurable lines. If I call myself a center, I have to have an endowment of so much. If I call myself a program, they leave me alone. Yeah. I love George Mason. But it's a kind of a, you know, it's a weird, that's a great question. That's a great question.
So there's an Adam Smith program that is the source of some of the funding from Summer Institute, but it's not a center.
Yeah. And people get really, really freaked out about these names. You say, oh, I want to do this center, and they're like, I'm going to sue you. You know what? And I don't know. So it's really crazy. Anyway, this is our idea. What we're trying to do here is, again, go back to that earlier thing that Buchanan mentioned. We're trying to combine economics, politics, and philosophy to represent a kind of Virginia political economy. Trust me, it's not just because I used to watch Charm that I do that. But this is what I really want to talk about. I have 5 minutes till right at 3:30. I'm going to shut up right then. But what I want to do here is I want to sort of highlight a thing about Buchanan, which I think permeates this kind of idea, which is that Hayek is a critical thinking classical liberal. Critical thinking classical liberal. This is a memo that he wrote, he was asked to write about the future of the MPS in 1962. Okay? So that's early on for him in these things. The Jefferson Center starts in 58. He's involved with that. Keep in mind, Friedman does Capitalism and Freedom in 62, right? So this is the time. And he's asked by John Jukes, because there's a big uproar at the MPS meeting about the future of the society. and this is, Jerry's a member of MPS, I'm a member of MPS. You'll recognize a lot of this in here. He complains throughout about what he calls professional libertarians that are not intellectually qualified to talk, that are part of the society. We need to weed them out and focus on the intellectual development. He says, the appropriate role of the society is that of ensuring the survival of a set of ideas and ideals, once widely honored but now only held by a minority of intellectual leaders in the Western world, but even fewer elsewhere. Survival alone is not enough, however, and sterility is the certain result if a deliberate clinging to old-fashioned cliches and concepts is fostered. Legitimate survival of the time-honored ideas of the free society can only be achieved through continuously critical examination of the basis of the libertarian doctrine, along with tolerance of change in the structure of libertarian thought. Buchanan is constantly asking us to challenge ourselves with the harshest criticism. He is a modern embodiment of the Bastiat quote, which is, the worst thing that can happen to a good cause is not to be artfully criticized, but to be ineptly defended. And so he wants to make sure that we shore up our examination and defense of these things.
Libertarian is not a word that usually is used in our society.
Well, not anymore. I think at that time it was.
Is this a free market fundamentalist? Was it just, in his mind, the same problem?
Well, okay, yes. So, and what I think is interesting is he is the classical, I think of Buchanan as a mindset of a classical liberal who's the opposite of Albert Hirschman. That would be too much of a thing here. But Albert Hirschman, one of the reasons why he's so wonderful for all of us to read is because he had a certain mindset, which he described himself as a propensity for self-subversion. And I think Buchanan has that same kind of idea. He's always pointing out the tensions in the ideas, which gets me to the paper that I wrote, which is the paper about the tensions that he's identified with the classical liberal projects. And those tensions are very easy to go through. Justice, unless you have a theory of justice, you're not going to have this. Unless you have an overarching vision. And then two, whether or not you cultivate in your population a sense of liberty and responsibility. By the way, think about the contradictions in his own writings here. So, in one of my favorite essays of Buchanan, it's called Natural and Artifactual Man, he says, man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become. And then he works out the implications of that. By the time he gets to be afraid to be free, what's his argument? I don't want liberty. I want to be protected, right? So which is it? Is it that man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become, or man wants security to be protected from the vagaries of the market? Okay? What his argument is, he wants to sort of tell the story. And what I try to do in this paper, and I promise I'll finish. What I try to do in this paper is I'm just trying to argue that there's ways in which you can answer each of these responses and try to put them in a coherent framework, which then can offer a kind of a vision of the liberal society which is both aesthetically pleasing and morally pleasing, as well as generates the idea of the prosperity and peace kind of idea, which is the analytics of it that he wants. So what I really want to, let's just open it up for questions. I have this, I'll leave this. This is a project that I'm working on with Elaine Marciano. But I think, do we have 15 minutes of questions or no?
20.
20? Okay, so let's just open it up for questions. But thank you very much. I'm sorry for the ramble.
First of all, I'd like to say, as someone who was